Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
Oh, wow.
Today, we're looking into something pretty heavy-hitting and honestly a story that really kind of stopped me in my tracks.
Mhm.
The capture of a British ex-soldier fighting for Ukraine.
Mm.
It's one thing to see headlines about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but when you see a case like this, it really kind of brings it home in a way,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. I think anytime we can look at these, global conflicts through the lens of an individual story,
Right.
it really does bring it home in a way that just talking about, troop movements or, front lines
Right.
doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be digging into today. We're going to be looking at the story of James Scott Rhys Anderson, the
Yeah.
22-year-old who served in the British Army and then ended up detained by Russian forces in the Kursk region. So really taking a deep dive into the timeline and everything that led up to this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think even before we jump into the specifics of James's story, it raises a lot of questions that we see pop up in conflicts around the world. That tension between the kind of global forces of geopolitics and how those forces can really impact individual lives.
Right, and it's hard not to feel that tension
Mm.
when you think about the timeline here.
Yeah.
This young man starts out as a signalman in the British Army. And for anyone who's not familiar with military lingo, a signalman is basically the communications expert on the battlefield.
Right, the tech wizard, essentially.
Exactly, keeping everything connected, which
Yeah.
is absolutely essential in a war zone.
Oh, yeah.
So he's got this very specialized skill set, training a career path in front of him,
Right.
and then he makes this decision to leave all of that behind and join Ukraine's International Legion, a volunteer group supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating turn of events. And, obviously we'll be getting into his motivations.
Right.
But just from the outset, it raises that question. What compels someone to leave behind that kind of established structure
Yeah.
and put themselves in such a high-risk situation?
Yeah, and from the reports that we've gathered, it seems that James felt very strongly about defending democracy.
Mhm.
He saw Ukraine's fight as a just cause that resonated really deeply with him. But, it's one thing to feel passionately about something from afar, and another thing entirely to put yourself in the line of fire.
It is, and that's, I think, where the story gets really interesting.
Yeah.
It's easy to admire that sense of idealism, the willingness to stand up for what you believe in.
Right.
But there's also a need to examine that decision-making process.
Right.
Was there perhaps a degree of, almost a naivete about the potential consequences? And I think that's a question that goes beyond James's individual story,
Right.
because it touches on this broader issue of international volunteers in conflict zones.
Exactly.
What are the motivations? What are the risks involved? And is there a degree of informed consent?
Right.
Are individuals fully grasping the potential consequences of their actions?
And it seems like there's a bit of a paradox there,
Yeah.
You have this drive to fight for a cause you believe in, but at the same time, you're stepping outside of the established military structures and support systems you might be accustomed to.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's almost like taking a leap of faith
Right.
into the unknown.
Into the unknown, exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the added layer of complexity that this all took place in the Kursk region,
Right.
which for listeners who might not be as familiar with the geography, this is an area in western Russia,
Hmm.
right along the border with Ukraine. So a very tense, contested zone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where the lines between those two countries become incredibly blurred,
Right,
and the risk of confrontation is just heightened significantly.
exactly. So it's against this backdrop that James ends up being captured by Russian forces. Now, the specifics of the capture are still a little murky. We know he was on a mission when it happened.
Right.
But then there's this other element that's really thrown a curveball into the whole story.
Right. The videos.
The videos, exactly. Videos released by Russian media that showed James expressing regret,
Yeah.
even calling his decision to join the conflict a stupid idea.
Right.
So right away, we're seeing this potential for manipulation.
Oh, absolutely. These
Yeah.
videos are a fascinating but also potentially problematic piece of the puzzle.
Right.
We can't just take them at face value. We
Right.
have to approach them with a very critical eye.
And that leads to so many questions. Is James speaking freely in these videos, or is there an element of coercion? Are we seeing a genuine change of heart, or is this a carefully orchestrated attempt to manipulate public perception?
Right, and I think those questions are really important to keep in mind when we're analyzing any information that comes out of a conflict zone.
Especially when you have someone in a situation like James's, where there's a clear power dynamic at play.
Absolutely. The potential for propaganda is always there, and we can't rule that out.
It makes you realize how easily individual stories can become intertwined with larger geopolitical agendas.
Exactly, and how important it is to be aware of those agendas.
Right, because what might seem like a simple confession
Yeah,
could be anything but.
absolutely. And you know what this whole thing with the videos really underscores for me?
What's that?
It's this broader issue of propaganda and misinformation
Oh, yeah.
that we see time and time again in conflicts. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a tactic that's as old as warfare itself.
Right.
But, in today's digital age where information spreads so quickly,
Oh, yeah.
it becomes even more potent.
Right. It's like a whole other battlefield.
It is.
It's the battle for hearts and minds.
Right.
Where information itself becomes a weapon.
Absolutely. And it's not just about swaying public opinion.
Right.
It can also be used to sow confusion, to undermine trust,
Right.
and even to influence the course of events on the ground.
It's wild to think about how easily individual stories can be manipulated and used as part of that propaganda machine.
Oh, absolutely. And in James's case, whether his statements in those videos are genuine or coerced,
Right.
they're now out there. They're being interpreted and reinterpreted through various lenses.
And that makes me wonder, how do we, as informed citizens, navigate this landscape of misinformation?
Yeah.
How do we even begin to separate truth from falsehood when even seemingly straightforward evidence like those videos can be so ambiguous?
Right. Well, I think the first step, and it's a simple one, but it's so crucial, is developing a healthy dose of skepticism.
Oh, yeah.
Question everything.
Yeah.
Don't take anything at face value, especially when it's coming from sources that have a vested interest in a particular outcome.
So it's like a trust but verify approach.
Exactly.
But even then,
Yeah.
it can be so tough to figure out which sources are reliable.
It is, and that's where critical thinking skills really come into play.
Yeah.
Look for corroborating evidence from multiple sources.
Right.
Consider the source's biases.
Okay.
Ask yourself who benefits from this information being circulated.
Okay.
And be wary of anything that relies heavily on emotional appeals or overly simplistic narratives.
Right.
Those are often red flags.
So essentially become an information detective.
In a way, yeah.
That sounds exhausting.
It can be, but it's also incredibly empowering.
Sure.
To be able to sift through all the noise and get to the heart of the matter.
Right, to not just be a passive consumer of information,
Exactly.
but to really engage with it critically.
Absolutely.
And I think that's especially important when we're talking about complex issues like international conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these are not black and white situations.
Right.
There are so many layers of nuance, and it's so easy to get caught up in the emotional pull of one side or the other.
But being able to step back and look at things from multiple perspectives,
Yeah,
that's really key.
it is. And all of this brings us back to James's story.
Right.
Because his capture and then the subsequent release of those videos,
Right.
it's triggered this global response.
Right.
And it's put a spotlight on this phenomenon of foreign fighters in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just about one man's fate anymore.
Right.
It's become a much bigger conversation about the motivations, the risks, the implications of individuals choosing to engage in conflicts that aren't technically their own.
Precisely. And that conversation is happening on multiple levels, within families, in the media, in the halls of government.
Right.
Countries like the UK are now grappling with how to respond to this trend.
Right, because on the one hand, they have a duty to support their citizens,
Right.
even those who make risky choices.
Yeah. But on the other hand, they also have to consider the broader geopolitical implications of their actions.
Right.
Overtly supporting citizens who are engaged in foreign conflicts
Right.
could be seen as tacit approval or even escalate tensions with countries like Russia.
So it's a delicate balancing act,
Oh, it is.
trying to navigate those competing priorities.
Absolutely. And it raises a whole host of ethical and legal questions as well.
Like what?
Well, for instance, what level of responsibility do governments have for citizens who volunteer for foreign wars?
Right.
How do you draw the line between individual freedom and national security interests?
It's like the rules of the game haven't quite caught up with the reality on the ground.
You're absolutely right.
And that creates a whole host of dilemmas.
It does. And I think what's so interesting about this case is that it really highlights the complexities of modern warfare.
Right.
These blurred lines between state actors and individual combatants.
And the challenges we face in a world where individuals can have such a profound impact on global events.
Absolutely.
Before we move on any further, I think it's worth just taking a moment to acknowledge the human element at the heart of this story.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical analysis.
It is.
But at the end of the day, this is about a young man who made a decision
Right.
that's had life-altering consequences.
Absolutely.
And, we can debate the merits of his choices.
Right.
But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that he's now facing an uncertain future in a foreign country separated from his family and loved ones.
Right. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the abstractions of war and forget that behind every headline, there are real people whose lives are being irrevocably altered.
Exactly. And that brings us to the question of what happens next.
Right.
We know that James is currently being held by Russian forces.
Right.
But his fate remains unclear.
Yeah.
There are so many possibilities, each with its own set of implications.
Well, they could put him on trial.
Okay.
Which would raise all sorts of legal questions about the applicability of Russian law to a British citizen fighting for a foreign army.
Right.
They could use him as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the UK or Ukraine.
Right. It's like he's become a pawn in a larger geopolitical chess match.
It is.
His fate intertwined with the broader dynamics of the conflict.
And we can't forget about the potential for him to be exploited for propaganda purposes.
Right.
Further blurring those lines between truth and manipulation.
Right. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a war that just continues to rage.
Exactly.
With no clear end in sight.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. The stakes are so high, not just for James,
right,
but for countless others caught in the crossfire of this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, his story, while unique in its details, it does speak to this larger trend that we've been seeing in recent years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This isn't an isolated incident. We've seen a surge in individuals from various countries, backgrounds, motivations, drawn to conflicts like the one in Ukraine. And it's something that's raising some really tough questions for governments worldwide.
Right. It's like the old playbook doesn't quite apply anymore.
Exactly. Those traditional approaches to diplomacy, to citizenship, to international law, they're all being challenged in this new landscape of warfare.
And I think it would be helpful to unpack that a little bit. What are some of the specific challenges that governments are facing when their citizens get involved in these foreign wars, especially those that are outside the traditional framework of state-sanctioned military action?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the legal gray area that these situations often fall into.
Right. Our existing international laws are largely designed to deal with state actors, not individuals who independently choose to participate in these conflicts. So it begs the question, to what extent are governments obligated to protect and advocate for their citizens in these scenarios?
Right, because on the one hand, you have this idea of individual freedom.
Right.
People should be able to make their own choices, even if those choices are risky.
Exactly.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have these national security interests at play.
Right.
And the potential for those individual actions to have broader geopolitical consequences.
So it's like this constant tug of war between those two competing priorities.
It is. And then you have the added layer of public opinion.
Right.
How do governments strike that balance between showing compassion for those who've been captured, while also discouraging others from following a similar path?
Yeah, it's almost like a no-win situation. You know, whatever actions governments take, they risk alienating some segment of the population or provoking a negative response from other countries. It's a real tightrope walk, for sure. And I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
But one thing is clear, this is an issue that's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
As we become more globally interconnected and as these conflicts continue to erupt around the world, we're likely to see more instances of this.
More people feeling compelled to get involved.
Exactly. For better or for worse.
So is there anything that can be done proactively? Are there steps that governments can take to address this trend and maybe mitigate some of the challenges?
Well, I think one approach is to focus on prevention.
Oh, okay.
Governments could invest in public awareness campaigns that really highlight the risks and legal ramifications of joining foreign conflicts.
So basically educating people before they make that decision.
Exactly. And they could also work with social media companies to combat the spread of misinformation and propaganda that often romanticizes war and glorifies participation in these conflicts.
Because it's easy to get swept up in that narrative.
It is, especially for young people who might be more impressionable.
Right. So it's about addressing the root of the problem in a way.
Exactly. Trying to discourage individuals from taking those initial steps that can lead them down a very dangerous path.
Right. But I imagine prevention alone isn't enough.
You're right, it's not. Governments also need to develop clear protocols for dealing with situations where their citizens are captured or injured while fighting abroad.
So basically having a plan in place.
Exactly. And that could involve establishing channels for communication with detaining authorities,
Okay.
providing legal assistance to those who are facing trial, and offering support to families
Right.
who are grappling with the uncertainty of their loved one's fate.
Because it's not just the individual who's affected.
Right, it ripples outwards to their entire network.
And it seems like finding that balance is key, acknowledging the risks that individuals have taken, but also fulfilling a duty of care towards citizens, even those who've made choices that might be deemed unwise or even reckless.
It's a complex issue for sure, and it requires a nuanced approach,
Yeah.
one that goes beyond simplistic rhetoric or knee-jerk reactions.
And this is probably an area where international cooperation is going to be crucial.
Absolutely. No single country can effectively address this issue in isolation.
Right.
There needs to be a concerted effort to share information,
Okay.
to develop best practices, and to establish frameworks for collaboration in these situations.
So it's about recognizing that this is a shared challenge.
It is, because ultimately, this isn't just about individual countries protecting their own citizens.
Right.
It's about upholding a broader principle of human rights
Okay.
and ensuring that individuals who find themselves caught in the crosshairs of conflict, regardless of their choices, are treated with dignity and afforded a fair process.
It's a good reminder that even amidst the chaos and the brutality of war, there's still a need for compassion, for understanding, and for a commitment to finding solutions that prioritize human well-being.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, I think that's a fitting note to end on James's story. Though deeply personal, it really does serve as a microcosm of a much larger trend, one that's reshaping the landscape of warfare and challenging our traditional assumptions about citizenship responsibility and the role of governments in a globalized world.
Yeah, it's given us a lot to think about. And for listeners who want to explore this topic further, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube channel Traveling with Elaine.
Oh, yeah, they're great.
They provide some really insightful analysis of international affairs, and they do a fantastic job of connecting those global events to individual stories, which is exactly what we've been trying to do in this deep dive.
It's a great resource for anyone who wants to really understand the nuances of these global conflicts.
Right, and the human impact they have. So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought. How does James's story make you think differently about global conflicts? What questions does it raise for you about individual choice responsibility and the role of your own country in navigating these complex situations? We encourage you to continue the conversation, to delve deeper, and to challenge yourselves to think critically about these issues. Because ultimately, it's through informed engagement and thoughtful dialogue that we can work towards a future where peace and understanding prevail, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative and thought-provoking.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and as always, thanks for listening.